When I lived in Southern California, I thought adulthood came with a very specific checklist. You drove everywhere, even if the place you were going was only a few minutes away. You planned your entire day around traffic. You circled parking lots like a hawk looking for prey. You bought enough groceries to survive a natural disaster. You quietly accepted that work came before vacation, and your health insurance was somehow tied to your job. None of those things felt unusual to me. They just felt like life. Then I moved to London 2 years ago, and something strange started happening. One by one, those things stopped feeling inevitable. Not because London is perfect, it absolutely isn't, but because I realized many of the frustrations I'd accepted as universal were actually products of the place I'd grown up in. That realization didn't happen overnight. My first few weeks here were honestly confusing. I remember standing outside my flat thinking, okay, where do I park? The funny part was, I didn't even own a car in London yet. My brain had become so conditioned to seeing every destination through the lens of driving that I couldn't imagine starting my day any other way. I kept looking for parking garages, wide roads, and giant shopping centers because that's what my brain expected a city to provide. London looked like a city, but it didn't seem to be organized around cars at all. At first, I thought that meant it was less convenient. I couldn't have been more wrong. The first thing London fixed for me was something I never even considered broken. Walking stopped being exercise and became transportation. In California, if someone told me they walked 20 minutes to pick up groceries, I'd probably assume their car was in the shop. Walking was something you did on purpose. You changed into athletic clothes, counted your steps, listened to a podcast, and called it a workout. Everyday life happened inside a car. Exercise happened outside of it. Those were completely separate activities. London quietly erased that distinction. During my first week, I found myself walking to the bakery, then to the pharmacy, then to grab coffee, then back home without thinking much about it. At the end of the day, my phone proudly informed me I'd walked over 15,000 steps. I laughed because I hadn't exercised once. I had simply lived my day. Somehow, I had become more active without making a single motivational speech to myself or buying a new fitness tracker. If you're enjoying this perspective so far, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed and likes the video. It helps me keep making videos like this. The more I thought about it, the less it seemed like a personal achievement, and the more it seemed like a design decision. London wasn't asking me to be healthier. It was simply built in a way that made walking the easiest option. That's a surprisingly powerful idea. We spend so much time talking about discipline and habits, but psychologists have long pointed out that our environment often shapes our behavior more than our intentions do. If the easiest choice is to walk, people tend to walk. If the easiest choice is to drive, people tend to drive. The history behind that difference is fascinating because neither country arrived here by accident. After World War II, the United States experienced an enormous suburban expansion. Highways stretched across the country, neighborhoods spread farther apart, and zoning laws often separated homes from stores, offices, and restaurants. You lived in one place, shopped in another, and worked somewhere else entirely. A car wasn't just convenient, it became essential. London took a very different path because much of the city already existed centuries before cars were invented. Markets, churches, railway stations, and homes had grown together organically. When automobiles finally arrived, they had to squeeze into a city that had never been designed for them. Once I noticed that, I started seeing it everywhere. My local grocery store wasn't a 15-minute drive away. It was around the corner. The pharmacy sat next to a cafe. Above the cafe were apartments. A florist shared the same street as a bakery and a tiny bookstore. In many parts of London, daily life happens within a relatively small area because neighborhoods were built to mix homes and businesses together. Instead of leaving your neighborhood to do errands, your neighborhood is where your errands happen. Of course, London doesn't discourage driving simply through history. It also does it through policy. Owning a car here can be expensive. Parking is limited. Insurance costs can be high. And if you're driving into central London, congestion charges and environmental zones make unnecessary trips even less attractive. At first, That sounded restrictive to me. Then I realized something ironic. I wasn't being forced to give up my car. I simply stopped needing one. That's probably the biggest mental shift I experienced. In America, I organized my schedule around my car. In London, I organized my day around places. I no longer think, where will I park? I think, it's only a 15-minute walk. That's still a sentence my California brain finds slightly ridiculous. British people casually describe a 20-minute walk the way Americans describe walking to the mailbox, but somewhere along the way, I became one of those people. Now, if something is 20 minutes away, my first instinct isn't to call a rideshare, it's to put on comfortable shoes. Walking also changed something I wasn't expecting. I started recognizing people. The same woman walking her dog every morning, the barista who already knows my coffee order, the owner of the corner convenience store who asks how my week's been going. Those interactions are tiny, but they add up. When you're inside a car, every trip begins in private and ends in private. Walking creates little moments of familiarity that slowly turn strangers into recognizable faces. Urban thinkers like Jane Jacobs argued that cities become healthier when people actually use their streets. And after living here, I understand what she meant. The neighborhood begins to feel less like a collection of buildings and more like a community. If this video has made you see everyday life a little differently, take a second to share and like the video. It really helps the video to reach different people. That naturally brings me to the second thing. London completely changed for me. Public transportation. Back home, public transit often carried a certain stereotype. Some people loved it, especially in cities like New York, Chicago, or Boston. But in much of suburban America, driving was seen as the normal choice. Buses were often viewed as something you used only if you didn't have another option. Moving to London completely flipped that assumption upside down. One of my earliest surprises was stepping onto the tube and realizing everyone was there. Students, office workers in expensive suits, parents with strollers, tourists staring at maps, teenagers coming home from school. Nobody seemed to think twice about it. Taking public transportation wasn't making a statement about your income or lifestyle. It was simply how millions of people moved around the city every single day. There's a historical reason for that too. London's Underground opened in 1863, making it the oldest metro system in the world. Railways became part of the city's growth long before widespread car ownership existed. By contrast, many American cities invested heavily in highways during the second half of the 20th century, and over time, driving became deeply woven into everyday life. Neither system appeared overnight. They're the result of decades of different priorities. The biggest surprise for me wasn't just that public transportation existed, it was how it changed my relationship with time. Driving demands constant attention. You're watching traffic, changing lanes, looking for exits, and hoping nobody suddenly brakes in front of you. On the tube, once the doors close, your brain gets a break. People read books, answer emails, listen to podcasts, or simply stare out the window, thinking about absolutely nothing. I didn't realize how mentally exhausting driving had become until I stopped doing it every day. That doesn't mean London's transit system is magical. Any Londoner watching this is probably already laughing, because trains get delayed, stations get crowded, strikes happen, and sometimes you'll find yourself standing shoulder to shoulder with what feels like half the city's population during rush hour. But even with those frustrations, I noticed something interesting. My stress shifted. Instead of worrying about traffic jams, gas prices, and parking, I worried about whether the district line was running normally. Somehow, that still felt like a trade I was happy to make. Another unexpected consequence was financial. Cars are expensive even when they're sitting still. Loan payments, insurance, fuel, maintenance, parking fees, it all quietly adds up. Living in London didn't eliminate transportation costs, but it made it possible to live comfortably without carrying all the expenses that come with owning a car. That wasn't just changing how I traveled, it was changing how I budgeted. The funny thing is, after months of using the tube and walking almost everywhere, I went back to visit the United States and rented a car. Within an hour, I caught myself calculating parking, checking traffic on my phone, and planning the rest of my afternoon around the vehicle. It suddenly felt like I was managing a very demanding pet that constantly needed feeding, attention, and a place to sleep. 2 years earlier, that had simply felt like adulthood. Now it felt like one possible version of adulthood, not the only one. And once that thought settled into my mind, I started noticing that transportation wasn't the only part of my life London had quietly rewritten. The next surprise was waiting for me in the grocery store. The grocery store was where another assumption quietly fell apart. Back in California, California, grocery shopping was practically a weekly military operation. You made a list, loaded up a giant shopping cart, bought enough food to fill an enormous refrigerator, and drove everything home in the trunk of your car. Success meant making as few trips as possible. When I first moved to London, I kept trying to do exactly that. The problem was that my kitchen had other ideas. My refrigerator looked like it belonged in a college dorm room. My freezer could barely fit a bag of frozen peas, and carrying a week's worth of groceries home suddenly felt like I was training for an Olympic weightlifting event. At first, I thought this was incredibly inconvenient. Why would anyone choose to shop 3 or 4 times a week? But after a few months, I realized nobody was choosing inconvenience. They were responding to a city that worked differently. Since grocery stores were only a short walk away, there wasn't much reason to stockpile food. If I ran out of milk, I didn't have to plan another driving expedition. I simply picked it up on my way home. Fresh bread actually stayed fresh because I bought it when I needed it, instead of trying to make it last for 7 days. Somehow, shopping became less of a weekly chore and more like a 5-minute detour during an ordinary walk. That experience made me rethink something we call convenience. In America, convenience often means buying more so you have to shop less. In London, convenience often means having stores close enough that shopping becomes almost effortless. Neither system is objectively right. One saves trips. The other saves storage space and planning. The interesting part is how quickly my definition of convenience changed once my environment changed. It reminded me that habits aren't always personal preferences. Sometimes they're simply the most logical response to the world around us. The same thing happened inside my flat. When I first saw it, I had the exact reaction you'd expect from someone raised in suburban America. My first thought wasn't, "This is charming." It was, "Where do I put everything?" American homes, especially newer suburban ones, tend to prioritize space. Bigger kitchens, bigger closets, bigger garages, bigger everything. London, on the other hand, has centuries of history packed into limited land. Victorian terraces, Georgian townhouses, and converted flats were built for a very different city, and high land values have only reinforced the idea that every square foot matters. Living in a smaller home forced me to ask a surprisingly uncomfortable question. Did I actually need all the things I owned before? At first, I missed having extra space. Then I noticed something unexpected. I spent less time organizing, cleaning, and looking for things because I simply had fewer things. My apartment didn't magically become larger. My expectations quietly became smaller. Psychologists sometimes talk about how humans adapt remarkably quickly to new environments, and I became another example of that. The apartment hadn't changed. I had. That doesn't mean I'd never appreciate a giant walk-in closet again. Believe me, there are moments when I dream about American-sized kitchens, but I've also learned that comfort isn't measured only in square footage. A smaller home in a neighborhood where I can walk to parks, cafes, grocery stores, and public transportation feels very different from a larger home, where every activity begins with finding my car keys. Those are two completely different lifestyles, hiding behind the same word, home. One of the biggest surprises waiting outside my flat was the local pub. Before moving here, I honestly thought pubs were basically British bars with older furniture. My understanding came almost entirely from movies, where everyone seemed to be drinking pints while discussing football or dramatically ending relationships. Then, one Sunday afternoon, I wandered into a neighborhood pub expecting a drink, and found families eating lunch, dogs sleeping under tables, friends playing board games, and a group getting ready for a pub quiz. It felt less like nightlife and more like somebody's oversized living room. That experience introduced me to the idea of what's often called a third place. Home is one place, work is another, but people also benefit from having somewhere they can exist without either responsibility. In many communities, pubs help fill that role. There are social spaces where people gather for conversation, Sunday roasts, quiz nights, birthdays, or simply because it's raining outside, which, despite the jokes, isn't every single day. Americans certainly have community spaces too, but they often revolve around different institutions. The point isn't that pubs are better. It's that I hadn't realized how much a neighborhood gathering place could shape everyday life until I lived somewhere that had one on almost every corner. Around the same time, another cultural difference caught me completely off guard. My British friends would casually mention taking 2 weeks off work, and nobody reacted like they'd just announced early retirement. In the United States, many people receive paid vacation through their employers, but there's no federal law guaranteeing paid vacation for all workers. Beyond that, there's often an unspoken pressure to prove dedication by staying busy. I'd grown up with the idea that productivity was almost a personality trait. Taking too much time off could make you feel guilty, even if you had the days available. In the UK, full-time workers are legally entitled to paid annual leave, and perhaps even more importantly, people actually expect one another to use it. That cultural expectation fascinated me more than the law itself. Work still matters, deadlines still exist, but there seems to be a broader acceptance that rest isn't laziness. It's part of a sustainable working life. As someone who works remotely, I found that mindset surprisingly refreshing. It made me wonder how much of my identity had quietly become wrapped up in being busy, rather than simply doing my job well. The next realization was a little more personal. Before moving abroad, I had always thought of healthcare as something connected to employment because that's what I'd known. In Britain, the National Health Service changes that relationship. Healthcare isn't primarily tied to whether your employer provides insurance. That doesn't mean the system is perfect. Far from it. The NHS faces funding pressures, long waiting lists for some treatments, and ongoing political debate. Many people also choose private healthcare in certain situations. But what surprised me wasn't the policy itself. It was the psychological effect. I noticed that conversations about changing jobs or starting a business sounded different. In the United States, healthcare can understandably become a major factor in career decisions because losing employer-sponsored insurance can carry significant consequences. Living in Britain showed me another way of organizing that relationship. It doesn't eliminate every worry about healthcare, but it shifts where some of those worries live. That's a subtle difference, yet it can influence how people think about careers, retirement, and even risk. Not every surprise involved deep social policy. Some were wonderfully ordinary. Take air conditioning, for example. Before moving here, I genuinely couldn't imagine surviving without it. I pictured myself dramatically melting every summer, while desperately fanning myself with a restaurant menu. Then I discovered that London's climate had historically been mild enough that widespread air conditioning simply wasn't considered essential in most homes. Thick brick buildings, smaller windows, and natural ventilation reflected a city built for a different climate. Now, climate change is making heat waves more common, and more buildings are installing air conditioning than before. During particularly hot spells, plenty of Londoners will tell you they wish they had more of it. So, this isn't a story about Britain having discovered some magical secret to staying cool. It's another reminder that architecture often reflects the environment in which it developed. What feels essential in Phoenix may feel unnecessary in London, and vice versa. As I explored more of the city, I became fascinated by something else I'd never really thought about: the streets themselves. In Southern California, roads often feel planned with remarkable precision. Wide lanes, predictable grids, generous turning spaces. London sometimes feels like someone spilled a bowl of spaghetti onto a map and decided to build roads wherever the noodles landed. I'd joke that my GPS sounded increasingly confused every time I followed it through another winding lane. But those streets tell a story. Some routes follow patterns established hundreds, even thousands, of years ago. Long before automobiles existed, people walked, rode horses, and traded goods through these same neighborhoods. Modern traffic had to adapt to ancient geography, not the other way around. Instead of endlessly widening roads, London often invested in public transportation, walking infrastructure, and preserving historic districts. Suddenly, getting lost stopped feeling like poor planning and started feeling like walking through layers of history. By the time I'd lived here for a couple of years, one final change stood out more than anything else. It wasn't a single policy or building. It was the feeling of walking home in the evening. Shops were still open. People were sitting outside cafes. Someone was walking a dog. A couple was arguing over what takeaway to order. Cyclists passed by. Buses rolled through the neighborhood. There was an ordinary rhythm to the streets that made them feel alive. Urbanist Jane Jacobs famously described this as eyes on the street, the idea that active neighborhoods naturally create a sense of shared presence. I'm not saying London is perfectly safe, because no major city is. Crime exists here just as it does everywhere else. But I realized that my perception of safety wasn't shaped only by statistics. It was also shaped by activity. A street with people living, shopping, walking, and talking simply feels different from one where everyone has already driven away for the evening. That constant presence of ordinary life changes how a neighborhood feels, even if you can't quite explain why. Looking back, I don't think London fixed 10 separate things. It fixed one much bigger misunderstanding I didn't know I had. I used to believe adulthood naturally involved spending half your life looking for parking, planning around traffic, filling giant refrigerators, worrying about healthcare through work, and treating walking as a scheduled activity. Now I realize those weren't universal rules. They were solutions to a particular way of building cities and organizing society. If you enjoy thoughtful comparisons between life in London and America, I'd love to have you here. So consider subscribing, and thanks so much for watching.